So I'm going to cover 3 sessions with you all over the next couple of days. So today we're going to talk about the ingredients method broadly, but then we're going to really hone in on ingredients, like what are ingredients, what does it mean to sort of think about them, how we identify them. Tomorrow morning we'll talk about design. So that's thinking carefully about how we design our cost components, either within a field trial or any other kind of study looking at costs. We'll think about the kinds of questions that we need to ask to get the data that we need for our ingredients. So we'll do some of that in the morning, and I'll cover an example, and then we'll do a section on analysis in the afternoon. So in each of those 3, I'm going to do my best to weave in examples and then as often as possible to give you guys exercises. So the hope is that this morning we had some history and foundations, and now we really want to start jumping into these different concepts within what we're working on, right? So we want some actual experience, and I want you guys to leave the next couple of days feeling pretty solid about what costs are and how to think about them in your own work as we then move into cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis. Okay, so we're going to start with the ingredients method. Okay, so as you may have gathered this morning, we want to know if a program is effective or if a certain approach is effective. Those impacts are absolutely necessary to understand and to know for policy making, but it's not enough, right? So we need to be able to say if something worked, and then what did we do to achieve that impact? So really our focus in looking at costs is thinking about this cost to achieve an impact. Cost to replicate an impact, right? So this is sort of a guiding principle that I tell myself and I remind myself on nearly every project. When I start thinking about what are my ingredients, how do I approach this, this is what I kind of always come back to. Okay. I love this picture. I love this book. It's Rosie Revere Engineer, and she was trying to design a machine that would fly. So she managed to do it. It worked for a few seconds. But what I really love about it is that it really highlights the different resources, or what we would call ingredients, that she put together to make this machine. So it's a Helio cheese copter. She's got like various baby doll parts. She's got skateboards, hula hoops, a broom, umbrella handles. So in order to replicate this, we would need to know all of those different materials and how those materials came together. Maybe some of the characteristics of those materials as well. Now, another really important question when we're thinking about costs, and we'll start to think about this more tomorrow, would be not just what are all of these materials, but where did they come from? How are they financed? Did she have to buy some of them? Did someone donate some of them to her? Did she find some and recycle them? Right, so we would want to know all of those different bits and pieces to understand what she's done, how she did it, and then if we wanted to take it to scale or replicate it. That information would be important for us. Okay, so just some review questions from what's been covered. So here I'm looking for you guys to participate. We have to stay awake after lunch, right? So I'm looking for, is this a cost analysis kind of question? Is this a cost effectiveness kind of question? Or is this a benefit cost kind of question? Obviously, the categories are not that easily distinguishable from one another always, but let's go with it for this. So which preschool model best prepares children for kindergarten for the cost? Okay. What's the cost of a supplemental reading program?
Cost analysis.
Should we invest in a high school dropout prevention program? Which program is most efficient in increasing post-secondary enrollment?
Cost effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. What portion of the cost of college counseling intervention is borne by the students?
Cost.
And what resources are needed to replicate this early intervention in math?
Cost.
Great. Okay, so I like to put this in context. This is my grandmother with me. My grandmother was a great baker. It was like one of her ways of really showing and expressing love. So she made these cookies that I really, really loved as a kid. So as I got older, I turned to her and I was, Mama, I really want to make these cookies. Can I have your recipe? So she gave me the recipe. So I have this like 3x5 index card. It has her handwriting on it. I'm very excited about it. But at this point, she was very old, so I didn't have a chance to make the cookies with her. I didn't realize at that point what a critical component that would be. But I'm really not kidding, and this is not a fake, like made-up story. Every single time I try to make these, I totally fail. So it's a cookie bar, and somehow, like in the middle, it's always terrible, and on the outsides, it's like really hard and disgusting. So what was, I would say, is like the best cookie in the whole world, I fail to replicate every time, and I make the worst cookie in the world. So I think, or I'd like to believe that it isn't just that like I am flawed. I would like to believe that I'm missing some information, right? And so I have her basic directions, I have her basic ingredients, but I'm missing a lot of the information about how these things came together. So how did she grease the Pyrex? Did she grease the Pyrex? What is melted to her versus melted to me? Where is the chemistry going wrong? Like something is breaking down. I can't remember if her oven was gas or electric. Okay, so that's just my general cooking example, and I'm sure many of you probably have something similar where you go out, you have something great, you try to replicate it, and it's totally not the thing that you're trying to make. So Clive mentioned class size this morning. Class size has been something that we know can be an effective approach to increasing student achievement. We know it can be especially effective for subgroups, and we tried to take that intervention and replicate it elsewhere. Maybe not exactly the same, but in California, they did try to reduce class size. In North Carolina, they're currently discussing setting a class size cap. But then what we're finding is that this is a really difficult intervention, or not an intervention, like it's just a reform to replicate, because when we're thinking about this from a policy perspective, we're thinking about it works. Right? This should be a pretty simple thing to do, but then we're losing sight of the fact that we need classrooms, we need teachers, not just any teacher, but a highly qualified teacher, a teacher that's had some training and support to teach a smaller group of students. And so this is just a great classic example of where replication goes wrong because we're not considering the resources that we need to replicate an impact that we found elsewhere. So when you guys go back to your organizations, you'll encounter people who come to you and ask you, so what is this thing? You went to this workshop, like what are costs? What is it that we're trying to do? Don't we know the budget, right? These can be great examples for you to take back and to share. Some baking failure that you've had. Class size is always a great one because it was all over the news. So hopefully this will help you somewhat. Okay, so we have outcomes in education that we want to see our students achieve. We have some goals that we're working toward. We want to think about how we get there. So the Wadsworth Clearinghouse offers us a really great place to go in and see, math. What do we know about programs or approaches that are effective at improving math? Reading, high school completion, right? There's lots of different options now within the Wadsworth Clearinghouse. I think we finally reached a point where the Nothing Works Clearinghouse label can be put to rest, right? So we're at a point where there's actually some things in there that work. We're building our knowledge base, but it isn't quite enough. So they have started to expand what they provide within the Wadsworth Clearinghouse to include costs. On some interventions, there will be a section that says something about costs. Now, what's really important for you guys to remember as we go forward is that sometimes even when that information is there, it isn't really what's needed to replicate that intervention. So a lot of times they might put purchase price. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of these nuances over the course of the week so that we can all be clear on what's a total social cost versus a purchase price. So Read 180 is a great example. So the WWC, they just redid their review of this program, and they provide some purchase price information, which I'll show you, but it's not complete. So just to tell you a little bit about it, it's a prescriptive program. It's 90 minutes daily of whole group instruction, small group and individualized instruction. There's videos, feedback, and class size is capped at 15. So when we go into the What Works Clearinghouse, we see some of this, where they talk about the package. They talk about for 60 students, it was about $43,000. They talk about this universal upgrade kit. So it just gives you some information about resources and then about purchase prices. So several years ago, Hank and some colleagues did a study of Read 180 to look at the costs. They used the ingredients method, and they started by going to, I think it was Scholastic, and asking them about how the program was designed. What goes into this program? What are the different components? How would that look in an ingredients analysis? So they estimated that it would be about $1,100 per student based on the design of the program. So then they went out and they looked at 3 sites that were implementing the program. So this is a true cost analysis. There are no effects here. They're really just looking at resources to implement the program. So they looked at personnel, so they looked at teachers, then they looked at other types of personnel, so that might be administrators, technicians, coordinators. They looked at equipment, and they had this other category that kind of captured a bunch of things like professional development, substitute teachers. And they came out with really, really varied estimates here. Now, as I said before, this is a highly prescriptive program. So this was one of the major first indicators to us that even though a program is designed in a certain way and that you can go to a teaching manual and it might tell you on this day you should be on this page and you should be doing these things, that implementation really can vary a lot. And the way that the implementation varies could be really quite important for the way that we're estimating impacts or the way that we find heterogeneous impacts. Okay, so that brings us to the ingredients method. All right. So generally you're going to want to go through and identify all of the different resources that we're calling ingredients that would be required to obtain a result. Now, as Clive mentioned this morning, you're going to want to always go back to your theory of change. So you think back to that theory of change, the logic model, think through what's guiding that change. How is that outcome being produced and how is it being produced differently from your comparison group? Then we'll think also too about, are those outcomes being produced differently for different groups or for different reasons or for different sites? And then how we might also capture that in our resources. Now the steps that we'll cover tomorrow, we'll be thinking about how we price those ingredients once we have them. So once we have quantities and qualities, how do we value them in dollar terms? And so tomorrow what we'll do is we'll work through using national prices. You could also use like a standardized local price as well. We'll work through that tomorrow. We'll also work through calculating the overall cost, the cost per student. And then we'll think about that really important question about who pays. So we want to know what does something cost and then how is it financed? And then we'll spend the rest of the week putting those costs into context with effectiveness. Okay, so this morning we talked a lot about what are costs, right? So we are talking about costs within the opportunity cost framework. And it's also within a cost accounting framework. So basically, opportunity cost is that everything has a value, and that value should be its next best use. Next best use. But the cost accounting framework, so it's like a word mashup almost. So the cost accounting framework is basically where you list. You just have this comprehensive list. So it's pulling from this economic conceptual idea and from accounting. That's sort of the history of where this is from. One thing to keep in mind as we start working through, and this is always difficult, but volunteers, they have a cost. It's just that that cost is borne by themselves. All right, and we'll go over a little bit on budgets. But I'm curious to know if any of you guys can talk to me about budgets before we go over some slides. Can anybody give me any examples? Like why would a budget not be sufficient for a cost?
Because the budget is what the agency is proposing they will spend, or they will need to spend to implement a certain program, whereas the cost is the whole bunch of conglomerate. As I said this morning, I was saying that a school may spend only 20% of implementing a program if it is staffed by Teach for America volunteers, etc.
Right, so not all of the costs, not all the ingredients are going to show up in a budget. Okay, let's see what all we have. So those in-kind contributions, those are not going to show up. Ingredients that were purchased in other years, those are not going to show up, but they might be important, especially if we're talking about computers. Okay, so let's say computers were purchased 2 years ago, and you have a tech-heavy intervention that utilizes those computers. You have to have the computers to implement. You have to have the computers to replicate. But they wouldn't show up in a budget because they were purchased in another year. Okay. Oh, just another tip also. The cost analysis is not your proposal budget. So when your proposals, so when you're putting together a proposal for IS, these are very detailed proposals. You have a lot of different things that are going into that proposal. But just be careful, that's not your cost analysis, and you may encounter someone who says that your proposal budget is similar to a cost analysis, but it's truly not. Okay. So I just want to walk through a few standards so that you can always sort of keep these in your back pocket also, so that when you're thinking about your cost study or when you're thinking about reading the work of others, you have some basic ideas of what standards of quality might be. So opportunity cost is at the top of the list. Are we thinking about all of the resources, and are we thinking about carefully to make sure that we address like teacher time, space, computers that were bought in another year, volunteer time, which might be parent time or another student's time or a person from the community. We want to make sure that we describe those ingredients with replication in mind. So as we'll go over the next couple of days, we need to understand the qualifications, the qualities of an ingredient so that you can price it appropriately, so that you can understand what it takes to replace that person, if you will. So if you have a teacher who's implementing a program with some students, you might be interested in the numbers of years of experience of that teacher. You might be interested in the training that teachers received. You might be interested in the degree that that teacher has. These are all things that your theory of change should point to as being important for that teacher to implement the program effectively. So we want to think about those things, but then you might also think about other aspects that would be relevant for replication. And this again would come from your theory of change. It would come from any sense that you might have in this variation in implementation that could be important for differences in impacts. So as Clive mentioned this morning, one of the keys here is that we separate quantity from price. So a budget, right, a budget is not going to allow you to do that. It sort of bakes all of this in together. It bakes quantity, price, and any kind of characteristics all in one. So it's difficult for us to know exactly how many teachers, for exactly how many hours, and with what qualifications, right? So that's just really important information that we would need to understand to unpack our impact estimates, but then also to take this elsewhere. Now, as Clive mentioned this morning, this isn't something that we can just really easily say, like, boop, 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 this is done. We are involved in this process. As researchers, we're more involved in estimating costs than we are in estimating effects. There are just more assumptions, there are more decisions to be made. I'll just tell you right away, this makes the first or second time that you do this uncomfortable. I am a person that I very much came into this thinking, here's how I estimate impacts, here's the model I'm using, here are the assumptions for that, I am clearly meeting these, I am estimating this effect size, here is statistical significance, and it's not that cut and dry. So the biggest thing here is that we be really transparent, okay? So we'll say, there are some simple decisions that we'll make about, like, we might be using prices for this year, and maybe we're using national standardized prices. But there might be a lot of other decisions that we make too. So, for example, it may not be feasible to measure parental time spent on reading at home on a per child level. So let's say we have an intervention where parents are reading to kids at home as a part of the intervention. But we know parents are reading to kids at home anyway, but we think that with this intervention they might be reading at home more. But this is a larger, bigger intervention where the parental component at home is a small component. And then in all of our evaluations, we have a really constrained budget for what we can do. So let's just say it's impossible to, in any precise way, to collect exactly per student what's happening each day at home. But we know that it happens. So then we have to make the decision for how we're going to incorporate that and then how we're going to test that decision. So this is where transparency is really key. So we may say, okay, I can't survey parents and I can't know every single day, but I can ask teachers. Teachers will have some information. And teachers could give me a range of information. So they could say, well, I know that I would say 90% of the kids in my class, or even better, from more realistic, 18 out of 22 kids in my class, they did the reading every night, and I would say the reading took anywhere from 10 minutes to 20 minutes. You can then use that information to make a decision to go into your analysis, and then you can also use that information to think about your sensitivity tests. So don't worry, I know that this sounds like a lot. We're going to keep going through it over the next couple of days. But here, transparency is really key. Then you want to be consistent. So if you're going to pick estimates that make your cost estimate larger, so that's going to be what we would call a conservative estimate. It's going to be one that makes your cost estimate higher. So if you have a range and you pick the highest, then it's likely going to make your cost estimate the highest. So that's what we're going to call conservative. Then you would want to be clear that you're being conservative across any estimate where you have that decision. And then if you're comparing programs, so if you're going to do like a classic comparative cost effectiveness analysis where you've got 3 different after-school reading support programs and you're going to compare the costs and the effects of them to one another, you would want to make sure that, just like the effects, you would want to make sure that the costs are estimated consistently and clearly across all 3 of them. All right, so let's think about how we're identifying these ingredients.
So, just one quick question.
Yeah.
Do you ever try to do an inter-rater reliability check where, like, you and Clive would do it independently, or is that kind of too far beyond?
You know, absolutely. I think it really depends on how much funding you have for this component of the study, when you're doing it. Historically, I would say the majority of this work was done retrospectively. So that means that maybe there's an effectiveness estimate out here that exists, And then the team is going to go and retrospectively estimate the costs that hopefully correspond to that effectiveness estimate. We have been pushing very hard over the last 5 years, I would say, to change that, to make it so that we're doing it prospectively. And in that scenario, there's much less of this issue of inter-rater reliability. There's much less of an issue of inaccuracy in your data and needing to triangulate through multiple data sources. Whereas when you move forward, you just observe. You might conduct an interview, you conduct a survey, your data are there. Whereas when you're looking backwards and you're asking someone what happened a year ago or sometimes 20, that can be really problematic. And then that's where you absolutely would want to be careful about some of those things. Now, as far as any other component where you have multiple people working, it's like anything else, yes. I think if you have 2 different people who are working through pricing, so we'll do some pricing exercises tomorrow. We've absolutely done it where we've had 2 people price the same data so that we can see if they're coming up with consistent prices and where they're diverging, and then we meet as a team, we talk about what's different, why, is there anything we should reconsider, and then we get everybody on the same page. So that's good thinking, right? So you want to bring all of those skills that are in your researcher basket with you into this. Yeah.
So you're saying conservative, then you gotta stay conservative all along. You also do like, okay, let's see if we go conservative for everything. Let's see if we go liberal for everything, just to see how
Absolutely.
Disparate it is.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a decision that you can make. So generally the goal is to have a main estimate. And that main estimate is clear and consistent, and you've been transparent about any decisions that you've made to get to that main estimate. But then you're going to have sensitivity tests. And so then that's where you might say, well, for this main estimate, we took the conservative route, and we know for 3 of the very big ticket items, so 3 of our really expensive items, we know that that was based on a range. So we want to also re-estimate this with the lower end of those ranges to see how it might change. So a lot of times at the end of the day, when we're looking at a per student cost, it doesn't change that much. But it's always good to go back, especially with those really expensive items, to see if we could use some of the qualitative data that we have to differently estimate it, to see if that per student estimate would change. Okay, so in addition to the theory of change and the logic model, program documentation is going to be really important. Carefully thinking through how the program was designed, what are the different components to the program. As I mentioned before, observing that program is going to be really important. Again, all of this is going to be useful for you to discuss with your research teams and with the programs that you're working with. So people generally do not associate costs with something that would be related to a theory of change or something that would require an observation. Observations about fidelity and theory of change is how we're changing the growth of this skill or this behavior in this child. Like, what does that have to do with you? And so then I have to re-walk them back through this whole process of, well, we are really about all the different resources and how these resources work together and the different ways that these resources work together to make your program work. So it's always good to keep these kinds of things in your head as you're talking with your programs and as you're talking with your research teams. It just isn't immediately clear that when we're talking about costs, these are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at. Okay, so Lego intervention, just for example. Okay, so if we had some pretend Lego intervention, let's say that there's a manual, right? There might be some Legos. Teachers, maybe they have some PD. What else might we have? If we're just going to brainstorm. If We have Legos, a manual, some teacher PD. What else might we have for a Lego intervention?
Good desk there.
Some space. Yes, some space. Some important questions to think about. When is this occurring? Right, so is this a pull-out program, or is this a whole class curriculum? Is this happening after school? Right, so all of those different pieces will be important. We'll walk through some of that. So your logic model, I feel like we're pretty good on this, right? Is everybody feeling pretty good? Logic model, theory of change? Okay. So generally, we classify our ingredients into categories. We generally use personnel, facilities, equipment, materials, other. Oftentimes we'll also include training kind of as its own thing. This helps us to mainly, truly, not to double count. Because you want to make sure that any people that you're counting for, that you have this list so you can carefully see who are all the different individuals. So it isn't just the teachers are providing instruction on phonics and the teachers are providing instruction on guided reading, and the teachers are, like if you're breaking it down that way, you could very easily end up with more teacher time than you have actually used. Or you could end up with the same resource in different locations. You don't want to double count, right? So we classify it this way to keep it straight, to keep it transparent, and it's worked pretty well thus far. It'll be great to hear from you guys how it works for you. But generally, this is not very prescriptive either. So if you don't have a certain, if you don't have facilities, which is a hard scenario to imagine, but if you didn't have some certain category, it's not like you have to use these. I would say within my work, these are my main levels of categories, and then within them I have subcategories often. So I'll have personnel, then I'll have school staff, and then I might have program staff, and then I might have volunteers. Okay, so obviously we need the quantity for each. But as I say, obviously, it actually isn't as straightforward for some of them as it might seem. So for a teacher is an annually paid employee. But is that contract a 12-month or a 9-month? Is that teacher working for the whole year on a curriculum, or is that teacher working only for a few hours every week? So when you start to think about design, so when we come back tomorrow morning, and we'll build upon thinking about what are all the ingredients, to start thinking about what are all the different pieces of data that we need about the different ingredients. And so quantity is one where we'll want to think carefully about the unit. So are we talking about hours? Are we talking about days? Are we talking about a whole year, calendar year, academic year? This really is a mixed methods approach because we need those descriptive data. We need to understand the context. We need to be able to match these ingredients to prices. So for teachers, for example, if we know that a particular intervention, maybe the way that it works is related to a teacher's quality, broadly speaking. So we generally know that our indicators of quality are education level, experience. So then for each teacher, we might need that information. And then based on that information, we can match that teacher to a national price that reflects those qualities. Okay, so this morning Clive talked a little bit about estimating your treatment, estimating your control, estimating an average cost, estimating incremental cost. He talked a little bit about some of these terms. Generally, my advice to you would be to think about the different resources that go into your treatment And then also think about the different resources that go into your control. Be clear about those sets of resources. And then talk about the incremental. So then talk about the difference between treatment and control and what would map onto that effectiveness estimate. So generally, this is probably going to be too tiny, but I can try. You're going to have a cost of your treatment, and you're going to have like an outcome, which is just generally an E though. Let's just make that an E. You'll have an effect of your treatment, and then you're going to have a cost of your control and an effect of your control. So what you want are the changes in each, right? So to get an effect size, to get an impact on an outcome, we difference, right? We difference out the effect of the control from the effect of the treatment. So for costs, we're going to want to do something really similar so that our cost estimate corresponds to our effectiveness estimate. So again, we go back to that first sentence. We want the costs to replicate an impact. Okay, so I have some illustrations that'll walk us through that. That'll be helpful. Earlier, Clive's illustration was from a different report. It was from an IES report. I think he'll get that citation to you guys. This is the one that's from the Weiss, Bloom, and Brock paper from 2014. And it really does a great job of laying out that we have a treatment group or a program group. We have a control group. And these things are influenced by the characteristics of the implementing organization, the client characteristics and the context. Then we have the way that these two different programs are taken up, your treatment and control, what's received, any mediators and outcomes. Throughout this process, we have resources. So we have teachers, we have facilities, we have the contextual resources, what they came in with, any resource, any changes in resources after they participated in the program or during participation of the program. So he talked about this as an induced cost. There are some interventions that we're calling a service mediation intervention that change the services students receive as a result of participating in the program. So we'll talk about this induced cost, service mediation intervention a little bit throughout this week, and then we'll do a webinar on it afterwards. So that'll be one of the topics that we kind of circle back to and spend a little bit more time on. But this graphic can help, so come back to it when you're thinking. So I found that it kind of helps to start thinking about types of programs. You might have a new program. So this would be where you're comparing it to basically nothing, right? This is sort of a new innovation. You might have a supplemental programs where you're adding it on to existing services, or you might have a replacement. So that might be more like the math curriculum that Clive had mentioned this morning. So where you're replacing one curriculum for another curriculum. So the ways that we address costs, the ways that we approach costs can differ based on these big basic categories. Okay, so if you've got this new innovative program where it's basically being compared to nothing, you're looking at something like this, where the contrast is really clear. You can go in here pretty easily and say, here are all the resources of my treatment, tally that up, here's the cost per student, done. Okay, but then you might have another program where it's a replacement. So then you really want to be clear about what's in your treatment, what's in your control. Maybe there's not really any difference in cost, or maybe the difference in cost is really small. But you want to be clear about that for your decision maker, for also understanding how the program worked, right? So when you're in this scenario, you might expect a larger effect because it's being compared to nothing. Whereas in this scenario, you might expect a smaller one. Now, the situation that tends to be a little bit more messy is when business as usual is kind of unclear. So we know that there are some services being received, but we really don't know how much. We really don't know how that differs from what's being received by this treatment group. I would say that research to date has done a pretty poor job of being really clear about this. You know, we often say, oh, kids were assigned treatment and control, randomly assigned, here's our effect size, did it. But really, to understand that effect size, we need to understand business as usual. And you know, while you guys are here today, our whole focus is on cost. Part of the understanding that business as usual is understanding the resources. So fidelity, yes, also relevant for costs. Natalie.
On the previous slide, if you are doing sort of like a randomized control trial, and you want to evaluate the efficacy of an intervention compared to business as usual. So because it's still sort of out of its research phase, the students may still be getting the business as usual stuff in addition to the intervention.
Mm-hmm.
But you would think that maybe in the future, if it's effective, then they wouldn't need those other services.
Mm-hmm.
So do you need to include that in your cost?
Yes.
You do? Okay.
Yes. So this is a really great question. So students are generally receiving bundles of services, either as curricula to teach reading or through a curriculum and supplemental support services. We come in with one new approach, right? And then we compare that one new approach to basically everything else that's going on. We usually have a little bit of control over what the treatment group is using and that the control group's not using the treatment, but not a whole lot of control outside of that. So when we create that, or when we generate that effect, that effectiveness estimate, we have to be able to say compared to what. And when we say just compared to business as usual, that doesn't give us enough information about the context to understand that effect. And so one way to unpack that is through the resources. So through saying, okay, our treatment group received this new reading curriculum, and then we know also that they received some supplemental support through Saxon Phonics and trying to think of another one, but I'm blanking, some other supplemental reading support service. But then we know for our control group that they received Saxon Phonics, like Ready Gin, and these other 4 like supplemental support services. So when you're comparing, you want to make sure that you're really clear about those 2 contexts and what they're receiving, and it's not just the one thing that you're changing. It would be the whole package that would go toward producing that outcome. So you may find in this scenario, you might find that the package received over here is actually less in resources than the package received over there. Right? Or you may find some efficiencies, right? So where one program may come in and provide phonics, fluency, comprehension, and writing all together, whereas in your business as usual group, maybe they're using 4 different programs with 4 different sets of materials, and different people know different things about the different approaches and the coaching that happens with those 4 different approaches, right? So there could be some efficiencies gained through your new approach that you would want to think about. So then from that, the Bloom, Brock, Weiss, Bloom, Weiss, I get it all mixed up. One of the main takeaways is truly that fidelity is relevant for cost. So fidelity of the treatment, fidelity of the control. So there's this great paper by Cordry and Peon, I think, where they talk about, in theory, we have this distinction between treatment and control. So when we start out to do an experiment, we have a pretty good idea of that distinction. Here's what treatment's going to be. Well, we say it's going to be business as usual, and here's what the treatment's going to be. But we know we need to understand business as usual better to understand this context, this contrast. But then generally, both the treatment group and the control group, there's some difference in the way that it's implemented that's different from how we designed it to be, or from how the program was designed to be. And so we want to carefully think about this from a resource perspective. So here they're talking about this achieved relative strength for an impact perspective. But you just want to take this same idea and think about it with your resources. And so to be able to do this, we have to understand how it was designed, how it was implemented, and then how it was different from control. Okay, so we have some group work, so we can all come alive again. All right, so I think Meredith sent you guys out a Excel file. Yes? Yes. We definitely need some group work. We might even need to stand up a little. Okay, so what I would really like to do, if you guys are up for it, I selected 6 of you. If you don't want to do this, it's fine to opt out. Maybe someone will take your place, or we'll just cancel the group. But I thought maybe Yinmei, Lauren, Karen, Nadia, Philip, and Rebecca, if you guys wouldn't mind leading a group, then what we'll do is we'll just have you guys give a brief sentence, a reminder about a program. Just pick one program that you're planning to study. Everybody will sort themselves. We need at least 2 people per group. So then the person who's one of these 6 will tell the others about this program, and then you guys are going to use the worksheet that Meredith emailed out to brainstorm what are the ingredients. So this is our first simple task, and this is exactly what you'll do when you go back. So hopefully for the 6 of you, this might be something that's useful. And for the others, hopefully this will be a great practice. Maybe you can get the person to share that Excel file back with you so you can take that back with you also. So one of you will take down notes, another one talks, and then everybody can kind of talk together to work together to come up with an ingredients list. We'll come around and we'll see what your questions are. And there are going to be some common themes, and so then what we'll do is we'll come back together, we'll talk about the common themes and questions, and then we'll close up. Okay, so Yinmei, are you up for it?
Yep.
Okay, can you give us a 1 sentence about your program?
Ours is we are evaluating a program developed by Evans, which they provide technology and also technology, PD of technology to help teachers integrate technology into their teaching in rural schools.
Okay, PD technology program. All right. Lauren.
So it's a teacher home visiting program. Teachers conduct 2 home visits during the school year and participate in 2 family dinners during the school year, and they go through a whole training process.
Okay, teacher home visiting program. Awesome. Karen.
We're interested in a new curriculum being implemented in a state preschool program.
Okay, new curriculum, preschool. Okay. Nadia.
Got a couple of options.
Just pick one, whichever one you think is going to be straightforward.
Yes. We have a federally funded initiative called Gear Up,
Mhm.
and we can look at the academic enrichment and support programs component of
Mhm.
that, and look at we look at outcomes as relates to
Mhm.
how they
So Gear Up, right? It's a TRIO program. It's going to help with high school completion and college post-secondary enrollment.
It 3 goals: increase academic performance, increase graduation rates, and college enrollment rates.
Great. Okay. Philip.
Redesigning credit-bearing English classes in college. So instead of just meeting Monday and Wednesday, there's a Tuesday and Thursday kind of lab and tutoring in which they go over the work from Monday and Wednesday. So
Okay.
from 2 days to 4 days.
So a new approach to teaching in
Credit-bearing
post-secondary.
English, the first credit-bearing.
Perfect. So like the gateway course,
Yeah,
right?
English 100.
Yeah. Okay. Rebecca.
New Teacher Center, they provide mentors to first and second year teachers. It's an intensive mentoring program.
Great. Okay, so if the 6 of you, if everybody doesn't mind getting up, we're going to move around a little bit. Let's just locate yourselves. So I would say 2 over, opposite ends, and just try to space out some so that the groups can come together, everybody can talk.